So Lebanon is in the news again, but we all know the story, right? A state that barely exists leaves a vacuum for a constant chaos of sectarian interests between different kinds of Christians and different kinds of Muslims, each allied with a different international power, fighting since the dawn of time. But what if that story simply isn't true? I'm Ramsey Nasser. This is Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill, and today we find out, what is Lebanon's story? We begin today's episode, as we always do, with lots of big questions, including, what better expert on Lebanon could there be than the Lebanese themselves? What do the Lebanese themselves believe is their national story? Do they even have one, or are they as narratively divided as they are politically? Well, to help us answer all of those questions and so much more, we are delighted today to be joined by Dr. Bouchra Saab. Dr. Saab is author of History Education in Lebanon and the Borders of the Nation, which is volume 56 in the series Studies on Modern Orient, published last year by de Gruyter Brill. Dr. Saab, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I also appreciate you tolerating that very simplified opening. It's such a rich and complex topic and such a sensitive topic that we're going to be addressing today, and not least in the times that we're in. But one has to approach any subject, find any angle in, so I appreciate your tolerance to that very simple approach. I've not been able to read your book cover to cover, but I have spent some time with it, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I'm looking forward to the conversation too.
Good. Shall we just dive into it then? I have to say, when my producer, Roshana, she sent me your book, I was a little bit perplexed, upset almost, confused. The only context through which I am familiar with the analysis of national history textbooks is the Palestinian case, where Israeli history textbooks are, as far as I'm aware, never politicized. They may be analyzed from academics here and there, but they're not really politicized. On the other hand, vague claims against Palestinian textbooks are regularly in the news and used as a pretext by Israel not to implement or not to sign one agreement or another. So I must confess, I really had a prejudice against the core methodology of your book. And then as I was reading through your introduction, lo and behold, you situate your study of Lebanese history textbooks within a whole field of Lebanese history textbook analysis, which you also position regionally and comparatively with history textbook analysis in Syria and Iraq. So I suppose my first question, to ease into it and to kind of orient ourselves, is about the field itself, which was heretofore unbeknownst to at least myself, and therefore I assume might also be unfamiliar with our audience. How prominent is history textbook study as a field? Is it something unique to the Middle East or formerly colonized countries? Why do people study textbooks or history textbooks?
Okay, so I have to start by thanking you for being very candid about what you called your prejudice against textbook reviews, which is not really a prejudice. It's a very understandable reaction, and also a reaction that I and many other researchers share. But let me start out by answering the last part of your question. Why do people study textbooks, and history textbooks in particular? At first, we have to define what a textbook is really, and to acknowledge that this is a relatively recent invention in human history. Textbooks were not always there, especially textbooks which were designed to teach, not any books which by chance came to be used in school. So this is a very recent invention. Therefore, textbook studies are also a very recent development in research. And textbooks as an object have many aspects, have many sides, have many specificities. They are artifacts, they are objects, they are historical objects, of course, but they are also a medium and a multimodal medium because they at least have text and illustrations, but nowadays they also have multimedia. And they are also pieces of literary work. We forget this very often. They are literary works. They are artworks also in many ways. So there is an infinity of questions you can ask a textbook, an infinity of perspectives you can have on textbooks. And they don't have to be educational. They can be historic. They can be sociological. They can even be economic because textbooks are also a market, an economy. And this is a very big element, a very big part of what textbooks are. And despite all of this, we have this tradition of textbook reviews, which started around the mid-20th century, which focuses on what is called like ideology critique. And this is a very reductive look at textbooks, I have to say. And it is normative, of course. And it is not only reductive to textbooks as such, but it is also based on a very false perception of how the human intelligence works, on how children perceive things, on how children learn. But again, as I said, it's a persistent tradition, not only in the Arab-Israeli context, but also this has received a lot of criticism in the American context. But unfortunately, it receives a lot of funding. And there is obviously agendas in plural behind this. But I am very critical of this particular field, and I am very careful about situating myself outside of this field. Now, coming to talk about the textbook reviews in Lebanon in particular, there is a striking specificity here, which is that most scholarship has been produced by locals. And this is very different from Iraq, very different from Syria, and of course, very different from Palestine. And even the European, the Western reviews or studies which exist, they rely very heavily not only on local informants, which is normal, but also on local analysis frameworks. Now, whether this is a good or a bad thing is a complicated question.
I have so many questions about that. What do you mean by a local analysis framework?
Well, most of the researchers who published a textbook analysis in Lebanon, and this has existed since the 1940s, actually, and still exists today, most of them are actually just like me. They are either school teachers or university professors, and they have very local preoccupations, and they have their own framework. And there is an established community of researchers in Lebanon, which happens to be taken very seriously by foreign or Western researchers for many reasons. I think the most important reason is that the Lebanese context is infamously complicated. And it is generally believed that the Lebanese understand it best. This might or might not be true, but this is the general belief.
Okay. I mean, I think what you're intimating is a Western academic perspective born of a kind of neocolonialism in the 20th century, connecting with experts in the field locally who share demographic characteristics with the imperial power, and then assuming that they will share an adequate perspective to control the rest of the quote-unquote native population, to oversimplify. Have I understood you correctly? Is that what you're implying?
There is many levels of complication to this. So I am very uncomfortable with applying the simple colonial framework to the Lebanese context because, of course, you find plenty of Western studies addressing Iraqi textbooks, disregarding, ignoring Iraqi scholarship. You will find this in Palestine, of course. You will find this in Syria. In Lebanon, you don't find this. And generally, the priorities and the frameworks are set by locals. Now, of course, these locals are historically known to be allied with or associated or identified with certain Western countries or Western academic traditions, because we are talking about an academic traditions in plural, and each of them is affiliated with something that exists outside of it.
Okay, I think I understand you. In my draft of questions and notes of things I wanted to talk to you about, I wanted to close by asking you about positionality. But I wonder if it would be more interesting to ask you about that now, given what you've just said. You speak in your introduction and again in your conclusion a lot about framing an understanding of your study and attributing your ability to shed new light and a new perspective on Lebanese history textbooks, whereas others were not able to some keywords. These include traumata, positionality, and horizon. And I wonder if perhaps before we really get into the subject matter, given your answer to this first question, if maybe we should talk about that now.
Yes. So the reason why I give so much space to positionality and to horizon in my research is, as I said in my answer to the very first question, that I wanted to clearly position myself outside of this field of one-dimensional normative textbook research, but also because during the first 2 or 3 years of my research, this is a project which, by the way, took me 10 years and which is still ongoing in many ways because it opens more questions than it answers them. So at first, the reaction of many older experts was, what are you talking about? There is no such thing as a national narrative. And the communities you describe or you identify as being excluded, they don't exist. Like, you are talking about things that don't exist, which made me reflect and ask myself, am I really importing some different framework? Am I just applying international trends on a setting which is not really appropriate for this? And actually, no, it's really a matter of generations. Different generations have gone through different experiences. They have gone through what I called different traumata. In the past 3 years, I have been developing an aversion against the word traumata for many reasons. But in my dissertation, I used this word a lot because most of us were started out by being teachers and professors in the field, by having experiences. Unlike foreign or Western researchers, the questions we ask are directly linked to the experience we have. And there is a feedback loop between our questions and our reflection. We also have the privilege of seeing change with the naked eye. So when I think about the generation of the 70s and 80s, the people who wrote textbook reviews or textbook studies, they experienced the trauma of the first years of the Civil War. They saw many of their students becoming militiamen. They saw authority being questioned in a violent way. So for them, this was the main problem that they had to address. This was the main preoccupation. My generation is very different. We grew up with the influence of the Syrian regime in Lebanon. We grew up with much more censorship. We had more hierarchical preoccupations. We also experienced revolutions in 2005, which 2005 I experienced as a student, but the following revolution starting 2011, I experienced as a teacher. And I saw my students evolving and growing up with this and the preoccupations changing. So obviously, this will shape any genuine research and will define the questions you ask. So this is why I ask questions about hierarchy, not about divisions.
Got you. Well, that's that little clip there, that last point. That's a very good summary. I want to tease that out a little bit more. And I want to ask you about censorship, which you just mentioned there. But before we do, I mean, let's take care of our audience here. We're speaking in abstract terms. Let's try to make it a bit concrete for them and contextualize a little bit the rest of the conversation. In your foreword to the book, you set up the conversation, you frame your study by telling the story of the polemical story. There was a bit of a scandal about history textbooks in Lebanon, and it went on for about 20 years before it was resolved in what you argue an unexpected and surprising way. Well, I'll let you tell the story. What happened between 1998 and 2018 in the Lebanese textbook scandal, let's say?
Well, before the scandal, there are roots to the story, and the roots are actually in the late 1970s. Back then, there were a series of textbook studies which highlighted, of landmark textbook studies, like We Cannot Forget This, which highlight the differences between textbooks in different areas and especially between different religious groups. And this was confirmed in textbook studies which were conducted during the Civil War and at the end of the Civil War. So this was kind of taken by media and by politics especially and oversimplified and made to imply that textbooks had caused the Civil War, which is, from an epistemological perspective, nonsense, of course, but it's very persistent nonsense. A lot of people truly believe in it. It's still today, it's one of the common things you would hear even on the street. Like, it's one of the things people repeat the most. The pluralism in the Lebanese education system, especially the pluralism in history textbooks, is one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why the Civil War happened. And of course, this doesn't make any sense because causality is much more complex than this. But nevertheless, the Taif Agreement, which officially ended the Civil War in the early 1990s, it stated very explicitly and clearly that there was to be a common mandatory national history textbook. And this was presented as a solution and as a preventive means to avoid future civil wars. Of course, this never happened. And the polemic and the scandals, which repeatedly kept happening again and again from 1998, which is the date when the post-war curricula were published and did not include history curricula because it didn't work. The committee could not agree on a curriculum. Later, when they did agree on a curriculum and they did publish one textbook for the early elementary grades, this textbook was very quickly withdrawn from circulation because, again, it caused a scandal. And scandals kept happening, scandals kept being repeated, commissions kept being constituted, and they kept shattering, which leads people until today to say there is no such thing as a curriculum. There is also this common narrative in history textbooks, which are sold everywhere, used everywhere in all types of schools, who share this narrative, which is not exactly the same as the one from the 1970s. It has changed, and it has changed in the same direction for several reasons. So, although there are many books, not one national mandatory textbook, there is one national dominant narrative. It's a fact we cannot deny.
Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like after World War II, Europe got the European economic and the coal and steel community, the EEC. And after the Lebanese Civil War, Lebanon got a common history textbook curriculum. Like, these were the kind of the forces. And it gives a bit of a wink to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, that history textbook analysis as a field, as an idea in and of itself, is an insult to an actual understanding of the ways that children actually learn. I understood what you meant in that response as suggesting that children are critical thinkers, that they're not just empty vessels who blindly absorb and repeat whatever they read at first blush. Is that what you meant?
Textbook analysis is not an insult to what I do is textbook analysis, but one-dimensional textbook reviews are indeed an insult to human intelligence, because you cannot pretend that printed words and images have the magical power to create attitudes and incite actions in human beings. You cannot expect this causal linear effects of printed words. And in the same way, you cannot expect to just rewrite a few sentences and replace a few images and make political or ideological change in this way. There are many cases where I wish this was possible. Like, I wish it was possible that sexism would end by changing words in books, but this is not how it happens. It is part of the solution in many times, but it is not all of the solutions. And sometimes it can become part of the problem. An example I cite very often are the textbook reforms in Iraq post-Saddam. If you look at the textbooks which were the result of this review, and you compare them with the textbooks of the 1950s, pre-Saddam, you find that the reviews created a monster. They created something like unidentifiable, strange, not understandable, very bad quality of print, a very bad quality of text, disrespectful in many ways. Although they made sure to include all the words that that they believed should be included, whereas the books from the 1950s are beautiful pieces of art.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying is that Iraq, after the collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime government, they got a bit of a Frankenstein curriculum, whereas Lebanon, against the stereotype of the country, in fact saw convergence towards a national story after, ironically, 20 years of headlines saying that the country could not agree on a national story. There actually was a strange convergence to common terrain, narrative terrain.
But again, a common narrative does not mean a narrative which is ideal. Solving the problem of too much diversity or too much divergence does not solve other latent, inherent problems. Textbooks having a national or circulating a national narrative does not make them good textbooks necessarily.
Okay. I love that as a line to explore. I want to know more. But we have mentioned censorship a couple times, and I wanted to know first a little bit more about the role of censorship in this story.
Well, yeah, censorship is a key factor, although in traditional scholarship, the Lebanese education system is infamous, I would say, for being pluralistic in a negative way. And the Lebanese authorities, the Lebanese central state is infamous for being sort of like incapable of imposing necessary censorship. This is true in some cases, but most of the time it is not true. First of all, because the Lebanese education system has evolved a lot since the last comprehensive, serious descriptions which were made in the 1940s. And since then, the Lebanese Ministry of Education has become actually the largest ministry in the Lebanese Republic, with the most important number of government employees, and with a very complex structure, and yes, a very effective censorship mechanism, which is not highlighted enough. But more known to scholarship is the sometimes very direct censorship based on the moral authority of religious figures or of major political figures. This happens all the time. Everyone is scared of this type of censorship. Every textbook author or publisher, every teacher, every school is scared of this type of censorship. And there is a third form of censorship, which is the indirect censorship caused by the existence of official exams. If all students, if all kids are going to go through an official exam, no matter how easy or hard this exam is, it means that eventually what they learn is going to converge toward making them pass this exam. This is an indirect form of censorship, but it is an effective form of censorship. And there is also, very important, the self-censorship exerted by the authors themselves, because believe it or not, it doesn't really matter which religious background they come from. They all come from the same profession. They all share a common culture. They all share the same social space. They meet each other while correcting exams, while making exams. They have went to university together, because there are not many universities who give teaching degrees. So they have a common culture. They censor each other and they censor themselves.
Okay, so picking up what we were just saying, the stereotypical assumption about Lebanon is that each sect will have its own favorite authors, publishers, libraries. As I understand the different sects in Lebanon, and perhaps we can enumerate the main ones by name, so our audience who's unfamiliar with Lebanon might have a sense of the lay of the land. I understand from you that they also have their own separate school systems. And then all of these are neatly divided into vertically integrated silos that really don't interact. And your answer to that last question really shows that that may not necessarily be true, at least in terms of the educators across these. But from looking at your study, can you share with us how much that stereotype of these kind of solitudes that are next to each other but which do not meet, how much of that really applies here?
There is a simple, straightforward answer, and there is a nuanced answer. The simple, straightforward one is that this perception is simply not true. Point. It is not true. The education system in Lebanon, and I am not neither the first nor the only one who have said this, the education system in Lebanon is a market. It is not necessarily a religious or political battlefield. It is a market, and a very competitive market. Now, the nuanced answer is that, of course, during the Civil War, this was true. And the studies which were conducted in the immediate pre-war years or during the war, and who have said this, of course, they had every right to say this because it was true. But it is not true today. And it might be partially true in some very particular cases. There will always be particular areas, particular communities, particular cases where a school would have these characteristics. And of course, critics will say this has to be censored, this has to be stopped because this is dangerous. And in some cases, it is true. But from a statistic point of view, the only case where this is statistically significant is with the schools affiliated to Hezbollah and the textbooks affiliated to Hezbollah. This is the only, and I'm not saying this because I have something against Hezbollah. It is because statistically, this is the only not religious community, because we cannot confuse Hezbollah schools with Shia schools, Hezbollah textbooks with Shia textbooks. Hezbollah do not represent all of the community objectively. But yes, this is the only place where statistically you can say, oh, this is clearly and visibly a community or a party who have their own agenda. Otherwise, it is quasi impossible to find like a single school in Lebanon where all the students belong to the same community and all the teachers belong to the same community. This is not a viable economic model. And it is also not viable for a textbook publisher to create a textbook which addresses only one community. They will not survive. Most textbook publishers are small family businesses. They will not survive by circulating sectarian content.
Wow, I hadn't appreciated how much the economics of textbook production in a small country impose an appeal to the whole. Yeah.
You have a tiny country with a very big density of schools. Schools are very dense. They are historically dense, with a free market of textbooks, and you have to impose yourself in this market. How is it wise? How is it possible? How is it rational to just address one particular group in one particular religious community? It doesn't make economic sense.
Fantastic. Okay, so in chapter 3 of the book, you magisterially, impressively, I was really awestruck at how accessible and simple you made it appear with these tables and charts comparing different textbooks and how they approach, include, or exclude all manner of historical themes. You made it look so easy, and you really presented in a very systematized, rational, accessible way. But there's no avoiding the immensity of the work to produce that kind of analysis, the way you proceed methodically, grade by grade, textbook by textbook, historical event by historical event, and you index one by one and compare all the contents of these. It's evidently quite an undertaking, and you transmit it through your work in a very understandable way to make this vast literature of another even more vast literature understandable, and to identify the threads, commonalities, and tendencies running through it. So I suppose what I'm saying is, if we're going to discuss Lebanese history textbooks, we're going to have to discuss a little bit about Lebanese history itself. And I'm curious about the different approaches taken to key themes. Obviously, your prevailing argument is that there is convergence towards a common national story imposed as much by the government curriculum as by standardized national exams, as by market forces, as by other variables. But obviously, it's hard to avoid being interested in points of difference and disagreement to see where the debates lie. And I'm going to assume my very basic bias is that the flashpoints will revolve around anything where history is still alive today and politicized today. So I'm thinking here, for example, about interpretations of historical events that would color relations with, for example, France and the West, such as descriptions of the Crusades or the colonial era or the birth of the Lebanese state itself, but also perhaps about relations with Turkey today might be a point of political contrast by different groups, and therefore any historical interpretation of Lebanese interaction with Ottoman history, Arabic or Islamic history, I would assume would be flashpoints, and perhaps thinking about what's happening right now in the region with the invasion from the south and Iran posturing as the protector of not just Palestine, but also Iran, that anything historically about any Lebanese interaction with Persia, I mean, how am I doing? Are my very basic assumptions of where the flashpoints among disagreements would be. Am I right? Where am I right? Where am I wrong?
Okay, so let me start by addressing the first part of your question. Of course, I make it look simple because it's my job as a learned school teacher to make things look simple. It doesn't mean that they are simple. This work took me 10 years, and at the end of these 10 years, there still are more questions than there were answers, because really, this is a field which is renowned to be an object, which is renowned to be extremely complex and also very intransparent, and with a lot of limitations due to many things, beginning with archives, non-existing archives, and ending, of course, with attitudes to textbooks. But now to address the second part of your question, okay, let me make things a little bit easier for you by going point by point, starting from the end. You will be shocked by what you hear right now. Persia does not exist in Lebanese history textbooks. It is a blind spot on the map. And this is not only true for history textbooks, it is true for Lebanese textbooks in general. This is perplexing. I don't have a shortcut answer as to why this is, but it is like that. Persia does not exist. It is not addressed. There is a blind spot. There is a blind spot, a huge blind spot, not only in history textbooks. In literature, you'd be shocked. In philosophy, it's a blind spot. Why it is a blind spot, I don't know. Of course, there are notorious exceptions to this. One notorious exception are the Hezbollah textbooks, but you should not, you would expect them to mention Persia at every turn. No, they don't. They just show a photo of Khomeini and mention Persia in one lesson at the beginning of grade 7 about the early days of Islam and the divisions among Muslim communities. And they just make a jump in time and show this photo of Khomeini and talk about the Islamic Republic, implying, of course, that this republic is there to correct a historical wrong which started back in the early days of Islam. But this is an exception. This is not the rule, even in textbooks of Hezbollah.
I must say, I'm really surprised.
The question why this happens is a different question. And the answer to this question is not in the textbooks. It is somewhere else. Now, coming to the Ottoman Empire, this is another point where textbooks converge, regardless of where they come from, who wrote them. The Ottoman Empire is the devil, of course. At all times, during all historical periods, the Ottoman Empire is the devil. Turks are uncivilized barbarians. Point. regardless of what the actual historical research says. Another devil are the Crusaders. And there is no difference between Christian and Muslim textbook authors. For all textbook authors, the Crusaders are the devil. Where textbook authors disagree is on the portrayal of European figures in Europe. The framing and the interpretation of European events, such as the Reformation, this is a point where textbook authors converge. And some of them sympathize with Protestants, while others sympathize with Catholics. Why is a big mystery. But yeah, this is a point where they diverge. One point where they both converge and diverge in a very nuanced, subtle way is the question of Palestine. And again, like Palestine was absent from the 1960s, 70s curriculum, but it is present in all textbooks. Questions about Palestine are not asked in the official examinations, except for 1 year where it was like asked in a scandalous way. But they are present in every single common textbook. And there are not the divergences that you would expect. Like, you cannot realistically expect a Lebanese textbook to be Israel friendly. This is not possible. You cannot expect a Lebanese textbook to mention or to talk about perpetrations either against Palestinians or by Palestinians. This, of course, is a taboo theme. But you see, however, textbooks diverge a lot on underlining and highlighting armed resistance versus diplomacy. And here you can see actually religious differences.
Religious, not sectarian, specifically religious.
Yeah, Christian authors differ from Muslim authors on this point.
And then this is uniform across the different Christian groups and the different Muslim groups. So it's not political, it's specifically a religious divide.
It is a tendency. Of course, it is initially a political divide, but you see this tendency, and it is very nuanced and it is very subtle. It is not what you would expect it to be.
I find this really fascinating. I mean, I don't want to position myself, but speaking on the Ottoman, it's hard to think of a way to frame it without turning this into a debate show. But I'm surprised about Cyrus and the lack of inclusion of the Persians. I mean, the Iranian discourse, for as far as I'm aware, for an extremely long time, has been to center Cyrus, to center the Cyrus scroll. I was in Antwerp a few months ago eating at a Persian restaurant, and they had a miniature version of the Cyrus scroll on every single table. And, the Cyrus Scroll, famously the first declaration of human rights, liberated not just the Jews from Babylonian exile, but also every single other national group which the Babylonians had controlled by exiling them from their homelands and dividing them into smaller different populations spread in different parts of the empire. And when the Persians took over, they famously, through the Cyrus Scroll, allowed everyone to go back to their homelands and reconceive the empire not as a dominating force, but as a plural force that could hold different sects and groups together as long as they were all in allegiance to the whole. So I mean, this is a simplified understanding. I'm not an expert on the Cyrus Scroll, but this kind of, Iran is very proud of its Jewish minority. And to the degree that Iranian speakers do break through Western media in the context of the current war, they will regularly make reference to the religious pluralism, and sometimes they will connect that to Cyrus and the Cyrus Scroll. So I'm really surprised that a plural state such as Lebanon does not engage with.
It does not. It simply does not. And Iraqi textbooks, for instance, during the repetitive war periods, have had several ways of engaging with Persian history and with this topic of Shu'ubiyya, which was very important for the Islamic Middle Ages. It has been also criticized by textbook research. Syria also has like different ways with engaging with Persian tradition or with Persian history. For the Lebanese national historical narrative, Persia is an irrelevant part of the world. We often ask, there is often this ideological question, do we perceive ourselves as Phoenicians? Do we conceive ourselves as Arabs? In the textbooks, actually, we perceive ourselves as both. But in both cases, in any case, Persia is simply irrelevant.
I did want to ask you about the Phoenician bit, but that was very simply resolved now. There we go. Okay, so we've discussed a little bit now through all that, and we could go on. I find it fascinating. I talk about this all day. But let's get on to your main thesis, which is despite these divergences, there is an overarching trend towards convergence. But we've not discussed so far or enumerated the elements of convergence. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, for a very long time, I hesitated about the methodology I had to use and what angle I was going to choose to look at textbooks. Am I going to just count mentions of different communities? What am I going to do exactly? And how relevant was historical truth to me? And the answer I found after a lot of reflection is I am going to look at these textbooks as stories, as literary works, and analyze them with the same frameworks. And what I actually find, and this is the most striking thing that they all have in common, regardless of their divergences, which do exist, of course, is that they all resemble classical fairy tales. Will all of the characters of a classic traditional fairy tale and also with the function of a traditional fairy tale, you have the hero, you have the opponent, you have the mission, you have the peripecy, you really have a classic fairy tale. A lot of the elements which are used to develop this fairy tale, a lot of the peripeties are historic truth. Very little are actually lies, but at the end of the day, it is irrelevant whether it is true or not. It is a story. And what is important for the story is to create the effect that it is meant to create. And for almost all of the textbooks, the effect the story is meant to create is preventing a new civil war. So yes, the Ta'if Agreement was not applied literally. There is no mandatory official textbook published by the ministry and distributed by the ministry, but it was applied indirectly and very efficiently, except for the textbooks which are affiliated by Hezbollah.
Okay, so speaking of convergences, one of the innovations of your study was to focus on the formation of the national imagined community through development of this consensus we've been discussing, but specifically with regard to who is included and who is excluded from ideas of national belonging. So if our national history is a fairy tale and there's a hero and there's a villain, one assumes the hero will be depicted to include certain identities, and the villain or people simply not in the picture will be excluded from inclusion with identification with our fairy tale's hero. The chapter where you discuss these issues, you call it One Us and Three Others. I know this is a big topic and that each of those three others is a question in its own right, so feel free to answer at length. But I want to know, who are Lebanese history textbooks? Three others. Why? And what can we learn from them being excluded?
Okay, so of course, anyone who is even a little bit familiar with the Lebanese context would not be surprised if I told him that one of the others are other races, simply. Actually, in popular discourse in many of the neighboring countries, Lebanese are renowned, infamous for being racists and believing in their ethnic superiority. And this, I'm afraid that this shows in textbooks indeed. There is a race hierarchy, at the top of which, of course, are the Lebanese. Then come the Arabs, but not all Arabs, urban Arabs, of course. Rural Arabs are inferior. Then come all of the others. And now, whether Europeans are superior to Eastern peoples or not, this is a point where textbooks diverge. But again, the bottom of the ladder is a place where everyone converges. Of course, it is Africans. And slavery is a stigma, not for the slave traders, but for the slaves themselves. There are many synonyms for the word slave, and they are not all equal. They are not defined clearly, but a different term would be used for a slave from a different ethnicity or a different nationality, and they would have a different connotation. This is a topic which no previous research has addressed, but it is a very important topic and a scary topic, actually. Very embarrassing for a Lebanese to look at these things, to acknowledge these things. And other, if I may say, and this is more surprising, are religious groups. Because, in the public discourse, there are 18 different religious communities in Lebanon, who all have the same rights. This is not really true because there are much more than 18 religious groups. In one area of Beirut, I looked at the records, and there are more than 53 different religious groups, actually. In the voting, among the voters, there are more than 53 different denominations. So there are much more than 18, but they are not all equal. And they are not all part of us. And there is a sentence, very striking, which is literally repeated in at least 2 of the best-selling textbooks. And it describes the population of Lebanon during the early days of the Ottoman Empire. It says the local population, brackets, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and the Aghrab. Aghrab is the literal translation of xenos, as in xenophobia, like Armenians, Syrians, etc. So not all groups who are acknowledged as religious groups in Lebanon by law are considered equal in the Lebanese historical narrative. Now, of course, everyone knows that the main 2 founding communities for these narratives are the Maronites and the Druze, and that most of Lebanese history as it is portrayed is made out of the different conflicts and agreements and similarities and differences between these 2 groups. Like, these are the founders. And then progressively, there are just very few other communities which, through the last 50 or 60 years, have sort of like made themselves a small place in this narrative. Shia, of course, have and still have their own narrative, but they have come to partially, at least, be acknowledged. Orthodox are timidly acknowledged. For Sunnis, it's also one of the scary things because Sunnis are everywhere as rulers. They are everywhere as oppressors. But we don't read anything about Sunni population. We don't know anything about them. This, of course, is dangerous because it assimilates, it makes all Sunnis potential oppressors. And of course, Armenians, Syriacs, they don't exist. They don't exist. But there is still a third other, which is women, of course. Women are not the enemy, but let me tell you one thing. In all textbooks but one, which is paradoxically the Hezbollah textbooks, women are almost never the grammatical subject of an action verb. They are just incapable of action, much less of reflection.
Is that a linguistic artifact, or are you referring to when a female subject?
This is a linguistic manifestation of a way of... You don't find a sentence where the subject is a woman. Because there is no action, there is no historical event where the woman is an actor. But of course, there are a lot of historical events where the theme or the topic of the harem is addressed, where marriage politics are addressed, but women are simply not subjects. And I think this resonates a lot with the Lebanese national anthem, which says literally that our men are born from the valley and the mountain. It is not women who birth men. It's the valley, and the women are incapable of action.
But they have the right to vote.
Yes, but they are not. Historical actorship, actancy, is not something they have. And this, of course, was very common in textbooks for a very long time. It's not a specifically Lebanese feature, but I think the key point here is that there are very few women textbook authors. This makes a huge difference in this case. Now, why the Hezbollah textbook presents women as actors is a different question, a very complicated one, and one I don't have a ready, straightforward answer to.
So we've got race, foreigners, and women. I had prepared a quote from you. It's quite long, but I thought it was really illustrative about the sense of self and other in Lebanese history textbooks. You say, quote, "The self is defined to a large extent through a form of essentialism, where Lebanese are seen as inherently belonging to one of the religious communities implicitly understood as founding communities of the modern state, the most important of which, as you said, are Maronites and Druze. The genesis of these communities, however, is either wholly neglected or briefly summarized, thus creating the impression that they are timeless entities whose existence is essential to that of the state. In contrast, other communities recognized by the Lebanese laws are excluded from the narrative or considered as gharib, forgive my pronunciation, which means stranger or others. The topics of genocide, ethnic cleansing, migration, and slavery are entirely neglected and can be considered taboo themes. While academic discourse consistently points out this omerta concerning the mutual perpetrations of founding communities against each other, it has been less attentive to the denial of the victimhood of others, whether Jews, Armenians, Kurds, or other ethnic or religious communities. This victimhood is especially denied when it is the self, or what is viewed as an element of the self, such as Arab Islamic civilization or Maronites in many cases, who took part in the perpetrating of violence. Thus, there is an implicit hierarchy among races or ethnic communities where the Lebanese, along with other sedentary urban Arabs, are considered superior to other groups, including rural or nomadic Arabs. The bottom of this racist hierarchy is occupied by Africans for whom slavery constitutes a stigma, unlike other populations such as South Americans who are ennobled by their victim status. As for the communities stigmatized for their violence and lack of civilization, mainly Turks, they are only judged based on their perpetrations against the self, Arabs in general, and Lebanese in particular, never based on genocide, slavery, or racism against any other. I mean, that little paragraph is, we could do a whole episode we could do 3 episodes on that. especially the way that violence is, the lens taken on violence is changed in order to produce one's victim or othered or included in the self status. Whether violence was perpetrated against you or whether you were the person who committed violence can be either a good thing or a bad thing depending on the outcome we want to produce. So there's not really a coherent approach to that. I mean, full disclosure, I come from a Palestinian Christian family. I'm a Canadian and Spanish citizen, among many other things. And that my own positionality, that background that I have really colors my reaction to reading these things. Well, one of the things that really surprises me living in Spain, coming from Canada, is understanding that different countries have completely invented and differing racial hierarchies. They imagine different categories, entire categories. Mulattoes don't exist in the North American racial hierarchy, and I doubt in the Lebanese either. And I just find it, the way that we invent categories and understand race, once one takes a comparative view of racial construction, one understands that it is utterly made up. And yet these ideas of categorizations and their positions, their relative rankings, are so entrenched in the geographies where they exist. I know this is a slightly different field, but as you study history and as you study historical narratives as represented through textbooks, did you have any thoughts on the construction of not just racial hierarchy, but the invention of categories of race within those hierarchies? What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, of course, I reflected, and I still reflect a lot on this. A lot of this is constructed, obviously, but I have come to have a problem with the term invention, among other things, because it is mostly used in Israeli scholarship to talk about the invention of Arab nationalism and to present religious and ethnic identities as primary fundamental identities, whereas national identities and national narratives are inventions. Of course, there is a truth to this. Of course, this needs to be addressed, but it cannot be addressed in this simple, unidimensional way. Nobody wakes up in the morning, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how hegemonic they are, no matter if they are white or black or Arab or Persian or whatever. Nobody wakes up in the morning and decides, okay, I'm going to brainwash all of the upcoming generations and I'm going to write a narrative. Yes, historical narratives can be looked at as literary works, but they are not literary works in the sense that they are written by one author. So nobody does this. And conversely, nobody can claim that by rewriting, that nobody can even claim that they have the ability to rewrite a narrative that has been written over 200 or 300 or even more years. Nobody can do this. Nobody has the right and nobody has the power to do this. And it is not enough to just change words in a book or change pictures to deconstruct such a narrative. Textbooks are a very fascinating object because they are a mirror, because they show us a lot of perceptions, a lot of things that we sometimes fail to see otherwise, but they are not causes and they are not solutions either. They just ask a lot of questions. We ask questions to textbooks, but they also ask us a lot of questions. And these constructs, these inventions, although I have a problem with this word, we have to look at their origin somewhere else, not in the textbooks. And textbooks are just the occasion to reflect on them, and we cannot magically change them also. It takes as much time to change them as it took to create them.
Gotcha. And I want to ask you about Christians, Palestinians, and capitalists. So I have so many follow-up questions to all those answers I would love to explore further. But in the interest of getting to those other important topics, let's talk about Christians first. You wrote, quote, although this study started by distancing itself from the standard classification of textbooks according to a claimed religious identity, and although most findings pointed to a shared dominant narrative characterizing all textbooks, it was clear from the analysis of the sample that some nuances do exist between textbooks, especially in terms of the attitude towards the European other, as well as the Christian component of the self. Institutional textbooks adopt a relatively balanced perspective concerning identifying Eastern Christians with the European other, avoiding the mention of any controversial topic. In turn, secular textbooks try to avoid generalization and stigmatization regarding this topic. However, East-oriented secular textbooks tend to associate Europe exclusively with Christianity, while they emphasize religious tolerance in the East. As for the Hezbollah textbooks, they are explicitly biased against Eastern Christians, particularly Maronites, who they sometimes explicitly qualify as agents of the European other. End quote. This sounds absolutely terrible considering the rich religious diversity of the region of Lebanon itself. As a Palestinian Arab Christian, the idea that there doesn't sound like there's any non-instrumentalized space for one's existence in this kind of mapping. What do you make of this? Palestinians, I mean, just to make it clear for our audience, have a very integrated understanding of the role of Christians in society. So many of our greatest public figures have been Christians. Yasser Arafat's wife was famously Christian. Edward Said was famously Christian. I could just run through the whole list, but we don't have this sectarian understanding of society. When you meet someone, you don't even ask if they're Palestinian or Christian. It's not something, it's almost taboo to discuss it because we understand that there is a unified national fabric. So I'm a little bit horrified. The notion, I mean, thinking less about the Palestinian case, let's think about the Egyptians, 10, 20% of the Egyptian population, not sure the exact number, famously the Coptic Christians, their Christian communities all through. I mean, the idea that one is either excluded through non-existence or placed as identified as purely a European other or an internal enemy. I mean, it just sounds really unfortunate for Lebanon to construct the Christian in this way.
Well, let me nuance this. First of all, really, we have to separate Hezbollah textbooks from all other textbooks. Hezbollah textbooks are the only place where there is explicit hate speech against Lebanese Christians in particular, not Jews, not Sunnis, Lebanese Christians, and specifically Maronites. This is incredible, and to be honest, it scares me a lot. Also because I come from a leftist Christian family, but a Christian family mainly. So yes, this is scary. This is very scary. Now, for other textbooks, this is very nuanced, and also textbook narratives do not really reflect exactly the reality of how communities are perceived on the ground. Lebanese society is actually much less sectarian than it's portrayed to be. It's very racist, extremely racist, but much less sectarian. What you find concerning Christians in general, especially European Christians, are a lot of misconceptions which originate, I think this is my hypothesis, which originate from earlier historical works who have not been, information which has not been updated. But these misconceptions are potentially dangerous if you assume that the reader does not know better or does not have other sources of information, like when some textbooks claim that crusaders created monastic orders in the East. Anyone who doesn't know any context, who doesn't have any other source of information, would think that all nuns and monks are there because of the Crusaders, which is simply historically not true. Monastic life was born in the East. It was born in the desert of Egypt and in the mountains of Lebanon. This is a historical fact you cannot deny. Also, when some textbooks talk about the Knights of St. John without really specifying that this is a very particular reality, a very particular group during the Crusades. This has nothing to do with any of the St. Johns, any of the many St. Johns. This is potentially dangerous, of course. But I have to say, a lot of the assimilation, of the very dangerous assimilation of local Eastern Christians with the West originates from a historical fact, actually, which is the very long alliance between the Maronites and the Franks back in the Crusader time. Yes, the Maronites were indeed close allies of the Franks who were present in Tripoli as early as the 11th century. And this alliance continued and manifested in many ways all through history. What all textbooks ignore and don't mention, actually, is that the reason this alliance started at the very first place had nothing to do with Arabs or with Muslims. It was initiated by the common will to eliminate other Christians who were considered heretic and these are communities who don't exist anymore. They have been. So this is a topic that is avoided by Hezbollah textbooks, of course, because they want to frame Maronites not as enemies of other Christians, but as enemies of Muslims. And of course, it is avoided by other textbooks because they don't want to frame Maronites as perpetrators of genocide. So this is a historical reality, but there is a difference between the reality and the way you frame it, the way you interpret it, and what you make it mean for the present.
Picking up on that, and this is going to sound like it's coming out of left field, but bear with me. There is a connection. So Miami, the city of Miami in Florida, the United States, has really risen to political centrality, not just because Donald Trump has his Mar-a-Lago close by, or that there's all this new tech money there, but also because it hosts extremely large immigrant communities from all manner of origin countries that the United States has, is, or wants to bomb. And the fact that these communities exist in Miami is really illustrative of the same imperial strategy which encouraged my Christian Palestinian parents to move to Canada in the 1960s. And that is to build up significant communities of wealthy elite Venezuelans, Cubans, Iranians, etc., which can be mobilized to cheer for and help legitimize imperial war against their countries of origin. So, witness the Iranians in Miami saying, yes, please bomb our country. Considering the affiliation of Maronite Christians with the West and the failure to establish such an association among Palestinian Christians, do you have any views on why this strategy was successful in Lebanon, but not in Palestine? Does it just go back to the Franks and the Crusades, or is there something more?
Well, first of all, it is very difficult to agree on what successful means anyway. And it is very difficult to agree on what history means for the present. And it is also very difficult to understand really how the readers of a historical narrative will interact with it and what they will make out of it. So the answer, I'm afraid, is not, once more, the questions are in the textbooks, but the answer is not in the textbook. There is a nowadays very criticized theory, which was one of the foundational theories of the modern Greater Lebanon back in the 1920s. Some people call it the functional theory, which boils down to the state of Lebanon, which many people qualify as a non-existent, a historical invention of the West. A lot of the theories, the people who theorized the existence of Lebanon claimed that this state has a function, namely as a refuge for minority communities, specifically Christians in the Middle East. It has the function to be an exception. It has the function to be a refuge. As I said, it also has the function to be economically prosperous, which is a bit ironic when we look at the present. But this is one of the reasons why, for instance, refugees who came to Lebanon were systematically given the Lebanese nationality when they were Christians, not given the Lebanese nationality when they were Muslims. But there is also another reason why people are given the Lebanese nationality. It's when they are wealthy. And this is also a very important element in this functional theory. And I argue, this is an interpretation, I argue that this functional theory plays a key role in the framing of historical narratives in history textbooks, although it is not mentioned explicitly. And I must say it would be very politically incorrect nowadays to even mention such a theory, but it does play a very important role.
I mean, that was my last question. I do wish we had so much more time. I have so many follow-up questions I wish I could ask you about that. But I did want to check before we wrap up. Is there anything else you wanted to add on the intersection of class with all of this?
A very important question. Actually, in my conclusion, I mentioned this famous trio, which is race, class, and religion. And as you notice, I also have a trio, three others, which is race, class, and gender. The classical trio in intersectional theory is race, class, and gender. In my results, it is race, religion, and gender. So why does religion replace class in my result? This is not a coincidence. This is not something I did on purpose, but there is a long tradition since the 1970s for Lebanese scholars, not only historians, but also sociologists and political sciences, to claim that religion is actually a sort of masquerade to mask or to obliterate class questions. So many historians would tell you that conflicts which initiated as class conflict, such as the civil wars of the 19th century, were later reframed as religious conflicts. And this interpretation is not only a way to just avoid mentioning religion, it has a lot of truth in it. And even I would claim that the fact that a child belongs to one social class or the other class has a lot more effect on what he learns about history and what textbook he uses than the religious background of his parents. So yes, in many ways, religion masks class.
This has been such a pleasure. I would love to have you back. We should do an episode on the intellectual history of some of these themes in the region. I would love to know more about the history of Lebanese state formation. I have 100,000 questions. This has been a really enriching and delightful. You've been a fantastic guest. I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for engaging with my research.
It's really formidable. I feel so small in the face of the work that you've done. It's truly impressive. It takes such a mind to be able to hold all of the different textbooks, all the different histories, all the different biases, and to be able to find the threads of meaning through all of that. Your work is truly impressive, and I would encourage all of our listeners to pick it up. Thank you for writing it and for doing that work.
Thank you, and I'm happy that you were able to engage with it despite the fact that it is very local indeed.
Yes, but these are somehow universal themes.
Exactly.
Here at Sustainability Matters, so many of our most engaging episodes are the most particular. So I have no doubt that our audience will find a lot of interest in the subject matter. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Bouchra Saab, and this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you'd like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on Lebanese history textbooks that you would like us to explore, write to us and let us know. Our email is podcast@brill.com. We would love to hear from you. And if enough of you write to us about Lebanon or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. For now, I will say thank you, as always, for being with us. I am your host, Ramzi Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.